only wanted somewhere safe to sleep. But this bunker had been waiting for decades.
She was 21 and orphaned. No home, no family, no claim anyone respected, just a brass pressure gauge and $220 she had hidden inside a flour tin. And with that money, she bought a decommissioned Cold War bunker beneath White Sulphur Springs, Greenbrier County, West Virginia, erased from county maps in 1974. The west ventilation shaft had collapsed. Groundwater stood behind the lower blast door. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Inside the main hydraulic lock was a sealed chamber no inspector had opened in 50 years, holding emergency gold meant for a ruined nation. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elara Vale had been preparing her whole life without knowing it. Her childhood passed through pump rooms and municipal basements. Elara learned where air moved behind walls. Her parents taught her to hear a bearing running dry and smell overheated wiring before a fuse surrendered. Her mother Miriam kept sharpened pencils in every work shirt. Her father Daniel carried folded diagrams whitened at the creases. They were civilian defense engineers who believed fear became smaller once a valve had a label and clean water had a second road. The person who made the work feel inherited was Miriam's father, Hollis Mercer, a retired filtration mechanic with one clouded eye and darkened fingernails. Every Saturday before sunrise, he drove Elara to an abandoned civil defense annex outside Lewisburg where the county let him maintain an obsolete sand filter for training. He made coffee on a resistance coil and set a kitchen timer while she stripped the blower housing. She learned to seat neoprene gaskets without twisting them, test airflow with tissue, and flush activated carbon until the runoff cleared. At noon, they ate apple sandwiches on the loading dock while the old fan wound down through several deep notes. Nothing underground forgives guessing, Hollis told her. He meant that careful work respected consequences hidden beyond sight: bad water in a clean glass, stale air in a locked room, one loose fitting waiting through years of silence. Hollis died in February 2019 after a short illness in Charleston. By the time Elara reached his rented workshop, the landlord had cleared it. His calipers, canvas tool roll, pressure charts, and hand-cranked air sampler were gone into an estate auction. Only the brass gauge remained mailed to her without a note. 3 years later, her parents died within 7 months of each other, Daniel after a highway collision, and Miriam from a heart condition, hidden behind exact schedules. Their 26 wooded acres above a limestone spring should have passed to Elara. Instead, Silas Rook, a contractor managing federal storage projects, arrived with polished shoes, low speech, and documents tabbed in yellow. He never raised his voice. He occupied rooms until everyone else became uncertain. He cited emergency easements, public necessity, and an eminent domain valuation worth less than one excavator. The last morning on the property was November 7, 2022. A deputy waited by the porch while Rook's survey crew drove orange stakes through Miriam's winter herb bed. Elara packed one canvas bag and laid the brass gauge over her clothes. On the kitchen table sat her mother's white enamel bread bowl. Beneath it were transfer papers. The final page carried Miriam's narrow, trembling signature from her last hospital stay, under a temporary access paragraph later treated as surrender. Rook stood by the cold stove, turning Miriam's fountain pen between two fingers. "You have until sundown. Leave the keys inside." Elara looked once more at the signature. Her mother had never spoken of it, perhaps believing there would be time to explain. The silence could no longer answer. Elara placed the pen in the bowl, lifted her bag, and walked past the orange stakes. For 6 weeks, she moved according to warmth, bus fare, and library hours. In Lewisburg, she slept behind a laundromat boiler vent where lint gathered like gray snow. In Covington, Virginia, she bought one motel night after freezing rain soaked her coat. In Clifton Forge, she slept in a disused rail waiting room until a custodian found her and quietly left the side door unlatched. Her money fell from $412 after selling her father's socket set to $301, then $264. She ate peanut butter with the handle of a plastic fork. At night, the gauge rested inside one boot, so no hand could take it without waking her. She returned to West Virginia because the mountains were shaped like something she knew. On December 19th, with $237 left, she entered the Greenbrier County Public Library to dry her socks beneath a restroom hand dryer. She spent the afternoon reading county disposal notices because Hollis had taught her that abandoned systems were rarely empty of purpose. Near closing, a classified advertisement appeared beneath surplus culverts and a seized road grader. Deeded structure, former auxiliary communications bunker, 4.8 acres, subsurface rights included, no utilities, access at purchaser's risk, taxes current, minimum bid $220. A grainy photograph showed a concrete headwall under vines and one blast door open by 6 inches. Someone had circled the ventilation tower in pencil. Elara read the notice 3 times, then copied the parcel number onto a discarded checkout slip. The deadline was the following morning. She kept $17 for food and placed the remaining $220 in a library envelope. Before dawn, she walked toward the county offices with the brass gauge knocking softly against her hip. By noon, the underground hole would have her name on it. The clerk's office opened at 8, but Elara reached the courthouse steps 20 minutes early and stood beneath the stone portico while sleet ticked against the columns. Her bid was the only one. By 10:30, she had paid the filing fee, surrendered nearly all the money she had left, and boarded a county bus running east toward White Sulphur Springs. The driver led her off near the intersection of Route 60 and Big Draft Road, 12 miles short of the parcel. She walked 7 before darkness closed over the valley. When snow began to gather on her shoulders, she found an unlocked hay barn beyond a split-rail fence and slept between 2 square bales with her boots beneath her coat. The temperature reached 23 degrees. Each time the wind pressed through the boards, the brass gauge touched her ribs like a cold hand. At first light, she crossed the remaining 5 miles. White Sulphur Springs appeared gradually through chimney smoke and bare sycamores. She passed Gillespie's Flowers with buckets stacked behind its glass, the Red Door Cafe opening for breakfast, White Sulphur Hardware beneath a faded green awning, Greenbrier Pharmacy with a brass mortar painted on its window, and a narrow shop called Allegheny Radio Repair, where 3 wooden televisions watched the street from the dark. The county clerk's annex occupied a brick building behind the main courthouse. Inside, wet wool and floor wax mingled beneath the dry heat of iron radiators. Elara approached a counter worn pale by decades of elbows. The woman behind it wore silver glasses on a beaded chain and kept one thumb pressed against a purple ink stain on her index finger. Her nameplate read MRS, Nadine Bell, Deputy Clerk. Mrs. Bell examined the envelope, the parcel number, and then Elara. "You understand there is no electrical service?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the access road is not maintained?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county has condemned the ventilation works?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand demolition costs become yours if the structure fails?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Bell held her gaze another moment, perhaps waiting for hesitation to arrive late. Then she opened a ledger thick enough to stop a door, entered the payment by hand, and placed the deed beneath a brass stamp press. The handle came down with a deliberate iron clack. When it rose, the county seal stood embossed through the lower corner. "You will take Route 60 east," she said, turning the document toward Elara. "Then Big Draft Road south for 6.2 miles. After the old water tank, there is an unmarked gravel turn beside a black walnut split by lightning. The parcel begins at the second cattle guard." She started to slide the deed across the counter, then stopped at the signature. "Vale," she said. Elara waited. Mrs. Bell looked again, this time not at Elara's coat or muddy boots, but at the shape of her name. "Were you kin to Miriam Vale?" "She was my mother." The clerk removed her glasses and folded them carefully. Without them, her eyes seemed smaller and more tired. "Miriam came through here with Hollis Mercer when I was still keeping marriage records in the basement. They were cataloging old emergency wells. Your grandfather made us test the hand pump behind the jail every autumn." A faint line touched one corner of her mouth. "He said a well you do not test is only a hole with good intentions." Elara looked down at the deed. Mrs. Bell rose, crossed to a metal cabinet, and returned with a narrow survey folder. Its cover bore the same parcel number. Inside was a carbon copy of a maintenance report dated June 3, 1988. The bottom line carried Hollis Mercer's signature. "I inspected that bunker," Mrs. Bell said. "Not often. Twice, perhaps 3 times. The government contractor stopped paying local crews, and then the records went quiet. Hollis asked once whether the access easement had expired. I told him it had not." "Did he say why?" "No." Mrs. Bell replaced the report. "But he stood at this counter exactly where you are standing." She pushed the deed forward at last. Beneath it lay a single worn dollar bill. "For your records fee," Elara said. "The fee was included. Then keep it with the parcel file." Mrs. Bell glanced at the bill, folded it once, and placed it in the shallow drawer beneath her stamp press. Outside, the sleet had become a fine, dry snow. Elara followed Route 60 past the last houses and turned onto Big Draft Road, where the pavement narrowed between limestone banks. A mile beyond the water tank, an elderly man in brown coveralls stood beside a mailbox shaped like a trout. His red hound watched Elara without barking. "You headed for the government hill?" the man asked. Elara nodded. He scratched the dog behind one ear. "Road washes out after hard rain. Stay left where it forks." The hound gave one low breath through its nose. The man lifted 2 fingers in farewell, and Elara continued beneath walnut trees whose black limbs crossed above the road. The lightning-split tree stood exactly where Mrs. Bell had said. Beyond it, gravel disappeared under moss and winter leaves. Elara crossed one cattle guard, then another, climbing until the road ended against a concrete wall pressed into the hillside. The bunker's entrance was broader than the photograph suggested. A poured concrete headwall nearly 70 feet across and 20 feet high at the center rose from the slope like the exposed edge of a buried foundation. Rust streaked downward beneath 3 ventilation grills. The flat roof lay under soil and young birches. No chimney stood above it, only a square exhaust tower leaning several degrees east. A corroded sign beside the blast door read, "Auxiliary Communications Site 4B." Beneath that, someone had painted "Closed" in red, though weather had reduced the word to 5 thin wounds. The main steel door stood open 6 inches. Elara removed her glove and touched it. Cold traveled through the metal immediately. The door was more than a foot thick, its outer skin blistered beneath gray paint. A hydraulic cylinder ran above the frame, and the locking dogs were as wide as her wrists. She turned sideways and entered. The first breath tasted of mineral dust and old rubber. Her boots sounded small against the concrete passage. Snowlight followed her for 12 feet, then weakened. She raised the flashlight borrowed from the clerk's emergency drawer and swept its beam across a decontamination alcove, a showerhead furred with lime, and a row of hooks still numbered in black stencil. The front room held 2 steel desks and a wall map curled inward from damp. Somewhere below, water dripped with patient regularity. The air smelled stale but not rotten. Beneath that lay machine oil, cold stone, and the faint metallic scent of standing water. When she ran one finger across a desk, the dust felt soft as flour. A second corridor turned left behind the communications room. Here the ceiling lowered and her sleeve brushed a hanging cable. The touch sent a dry whisper through the conduit trays. She found a bunk room with 6 empty frames, a lavatory whose pipes had split, and a generator chamber where a rusted diesel unit rested on cracked vibration pads. The fuel tank answered hollowly when she tapped it. Farther back, a locked interior blast door divided the upper level from the descending service passage. A brown water line marked the concrete 18 inches above the floor. Elara crouched and listened. Behind the door came a deep, almost inaudible movement, not machinery, but water shifting somewhere under pressure. She returned to the entrance before daylight failed. From her bag, she took a candle, 2 crackers, the brass gauge, and the deed. She spread her coat on the floor of the communications room and wedged an empty desk drawer beneath the outer blast door so the wind could not close it. The cracker tasted of paper. The candle carried the smell of warm wax into the stale air. Beyond its small circle, the bunker remained enormous and unmeasured. Elara placed the gauge beside her head. Its glass face caught the flame, and for an instant the motionless needle appeared ready to rise. The bunker had been waiting. Part 3 continues directly from the uploaded structure and established continuity. At first light, Elara began with water. The surface well stood 40 yards uphill from the entrance, hidden beneath a collapsed cedar cover. She lowered a weighted string and found water at 31 feet, then pumped until rust-colored flow cleared to a thin, cold stream. She did not drink it. She filled 2 glass jars marked 1 raw and 1 boiled and placed both where sunlight might reveal sediment. The outhouse was farther downslope, a government-built concrete privy disguised beneath weathered boards. One hinge had failed and the seat was rimmed with frost, but the vent pipe still drew. Elara repaired the door with baling wire and learned to carry the flashlight between her teeth. By the 3rd day, she knew the bunker's sounds. The communications room floor clicked near the eastern wall where a conduit expanded with temperature. The generator chamber gave one hollow knock after sunset. A steel plate outside the galley squealed only when stepped on at its left edge. She began placing her feet accordingly, moving through darkness without waking every echo. White Sulphur hardware smelled of kerosene seed envelopes and old pine shelving. Its owner, Owen Pike, had one eyebrow bleached white by a chemical burn and a carpenter's pencil tucked horizontally through his beard. He watched Elara place $6.12 on the counter. "I need more than this buys," she said. "Most people do." She showed him the deed and Hollis's brass gauge. Owen turned the gauge over, found the initials scratched near the threaded fitting, and set it down more gently than he had lifted it. "Hollis Mercer rebuilt my father's well pump during the flood of '85. I cannot promise when I can pay. You can promise whether you will." "I will." He opened a ruled account book and wrote Elara Vale Site 4B across a clean page. "Do not make me regret good handwriting," he said. He sold her a chimney brush for $8.75, 30 feet of fiberglass rod for $11.40, a galvanized bucket for $3.20, stove cement for $4.85, and a used pipe wrench for $6.50. Then he placed a stained paperback on top of the pile. The cover read, "Repairing Rural Buildings and Small Utility Systems." "That one's free," he said. "It has been wrong on my shelf for 20 years. Perhaps it will be right underground." The bunker's emergency galley had a narrow masonry chimney rising through the entrance headwall beneath the soil-covered roof. Elara removed the stove collar, sealed the room's doorway with a damp blanket, and pushed the brush upward 1 rod at a time. The first pass brought down dry flakes. The second released a black sheet of creosote that struck the bucket with the sound of gravel. A blockage waited 9 feet above the firebox. She tied a steel washer beneath the brush and worked it through the obstruction with short upward blows, careful not to crack the clay liner. Twigs, walnut shells, and the remains of a bird's nest descended in pieces. After 5 hours, her shoulders trembled. After 7, she could see a pale circle of daylight when she held a mirror beneath the flue. She checked the draft with a strip of tissue before lighting anything. The paper leaned toward the opening. Elara built the first fire from pencil-thick sticks, then wrist-thick splits, never feeding more wood than the cold masonry could accept. Moisture hissed from the joints. Smoke curled once beneath the collar, found the repaired seal, and rose cleanly. She heated canned beans in a dented steel pan and placed 2 slices of bread on the stoveplate. The bread blackened at one corner. She ate both pieces while sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, holding the warm pan between her palms. It was the first hot meal she had cooked since leaving home. On the fourth morning, she entered the maintenance workroom beyond the generator chamber. Dust lay over everything except a narrow line beneath the ceiling where condensation had traveled. A steel bench occupied the center. Above it hung a differential pressure manometer with its red fluid settled below zero. Beside it were a hand-cranked blower tester, 3 boxed respirator cartridges, a copper sampling tube, a roll of gasket cloth, a glass hydrometer in a wooden case, and 2 filter screens framed in corroded aluminum. A gray cabinet held engineering logs swollen by damp. The last object was the main interior blast door. It separated the workroom from the descending corridor. 6 hydraulic locking dogs surrounded its edge, each connected to a central mechanism enclosed by a circular steel housing. A manual lever stood at shoulder height. Its rubber grip had hardened and split. Elara wiped the housing with kerosene and found inspection marks beneath the grime. 5 bolt heads rang sharply when tapped with the wrench. The 6th gave a muted note. She tapped them again in sequence. Bright, 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 dull. The dull bolt sat beside the lower hydraulic cylinder. It looked ordinary until she measured it against the others. Its head projected 3/16 of an inch farther from the housing. Elara tried the wrench. The bolt turned too easily. Behind it was no threaded shaft, only a smooth steel pin. She drew the pin outward and heard something shift inside the housing. The circular cover remained fixed, but its weight changed beneath her palm. One side now moved a fraction when pressed. She tested it with the pipe wrench as a lever. The cover weighed perhaps 60 pounds, yet the lower edge lifted as though counterbalanced. A hidden hinge opened along the right side. Behind the plate lay a cavity built into the locking assembly. A cedar disc, darkened nearly black with age, had been wedged between the hydraulic manifold and a false interior wall. It carried Hollis's initials cut with the point of a knife. HM. Elara sat back on her heels. The workroom seemed to draw farther away from her, though nothing moved except the beam of her flashlight. She removed the disc. The false wall released with a dry metallic click. Inside were 4 packages wrapped in waxed canvas and tied with flat cotton tape. She did not cut the knots. She loosened each one with the awl from her pocket and laid the tape in straight lengths beside her knee. The first package held Hollis's tools, a brass caliper, 2 pressure test fittings, a folding rule, a seal puller ground from an old screwdriver, and the canvas roll missing from his workshop. His name was written inside in Miriam's hand. The second held raw materials sealed against damp neoprene sheet, activated carbon cloth, ceramic filter elements, copper mesh, and packets of silver-impregnated resin. Dates had been penciled on each wrapper, the newest from 1991. The third package was a tin document box. Its lid bore no label. Elara left it closed. The fourth was heavier than the others. Beneath 2 layers of oilcloth sat a rectangular steel case with a government inventory seal. The lead wire had already been broken, then carefully twisted together again. Elara lifted the lid. Inside were narrow bars wrapped in brown paper, each stamped with weight and fineness. Between them rested canvas sacks tied with red cord. She carried everything to the bench before opening the first sack. Gold coins slipped into her palm with a dense, controlled weight, unlike loose change. There were $20 St. Gaudens pieces, $10 Indian head eagles, British sovereigns, and Canadian $5 coins. Each stack had been counted, wrapped, and marked in blue pencil. Beneath the coins lay 6 1-kilogram bullion bars and 12 smaller 10-ounce bars, all recorded on a typed emergency reserve sheet. Elara checked every line. She counted once by denomination, once by weight, and once by the handwritten inventory numbers. The bars and coins represented $150,037.50 at the reserve valuation entered on the sheet. She wrote the total on the concrete floor in chalk, then erased it and counted again. The figure did not change. At the bottom of the final sack rested a bronze military medal on a faded ribbon. It was a Purple Heart dated 1952 on the small paper envelope beneath it. The name typed across the envelope was Thomas Elias Mercer. Elara knew no Thomas Mercer. A letter lay beneath the medal, folded inside a waterproof sleeve. The address on its face was not a place. It read, "For the one who opens the door carefully." She recognized the handwriting before allowing herself to study it. Hollis formed his capital O like a pressure dial round and slightly open at the top. Elara did not read the letter. She returned the coins to their marked sacks, wrapped the bars, and placed the tools on the bench in the order Hollis had once carried them. The sealed letter went inside her coat. Outside evening had settled across the hill. Snowmelt ran through the drainage ditch beside the access road, gathering beneath a skin of ice before disappearing into the culvert. Elara walked to the surface well and sat on its concrete rim. The water below reflected no sky. She listened to it move through limestone, slow and unseen, carrying whatever the mountain released. The bunker had been waiting. Morning entered through the 6-inch opening of the outer blast door as a narrow blade of silver. Elara carried the letter to the communications room and set Hollis's brass gauge beside it. The handwriting on the waterproof sleeve was unmistakable block letters for warnings, a slanted hand for names, and capital O's left slightly open at the top. She warmed her fingers around a tin cup before breaking the brittle seal. Inside was a single sheet folded into quarters. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the locking plate without damaging the hydraulic manifold, then you have already shown more patience than the people who abandoned this place. My name is Hollis Andrew Mercer. I am writing in Charleston, West Virginia, under the care of Dr. Lenora Vance, who tells me the cancer in my pancreas has moved beyond useful surgery. She speaks honestly, and I am grateful for that. You deserve to know the line behind these tools. Elias Mercer, born in 1859 near Staunton, Virginia, maintained spring houses and mine pumps until 1917. His daughter Ruth Mercer, born in 1888 in Greenbrier County, designed sand filters for mountain schools after the influenza year. Ruth's son, Thomas Elias Mercer, born in 1927 in Lewisburg, became an Army engineer and was lost in Korea in 1952. I was born the following year and carried his name through my mother's stories. My daughter Miriam Vale was born in 1964 and learned every system I could teach her. Her child may never read this, but the work belongs to no surname alone. The government closed the auxiliary trade here on September 30th, 1991. After that came more than 30 years of silence, broken only by inspections no one wished to fund and promises no office intended to keep. The reserve in the steel case was assigned to emergency continuity operations. It was never entered in the county surrender inventory. I kept it hidden because contractors had begun stripping copper pumps and records from every site they touched. I could not prove theft before it happened, but I could prevent one room from being emptied. Use the systems carefully. Heat old neoprene to no more than 160 degrees Fahrenheit before shaping it. Flush activated carbon for 12 minutes before placing it under load. Mix purification resin at 1 part silver medium to 4 parts washed carbon by volume. When restarting the air plant, run the blower at 1/4 capacity for 20 minutes before increasing pressure. Machines remember neglect, but they also reveal it. Inheritance is not what rests untouched in a box. It is the hand that cleans the threads before fitting the valve, the person who tests the water twice, and the decision to leave instructions for someone whose face you will never see. Behind the bunker 30 paces east of the surface well, you will find a limestone marker beneath a leaning hemlock. Thomas's service number is cut into its lower edge. The metal belongs there only in remembrance. Do not bury it. Take what you require to make the place safe. Keep the remainder protected from those who confuse possession with stewardship. One day leave something useful for the next careful person. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Hollis Andrew Mercer, February 6, 2009. Elara read the letter twice. The first time she stopped at Miriam's name. The second time she placed one finger beneath each technical instruction as though Hollis were speaking across the steel bench. When she finished, she folded the paper along its original creases, pressing each seam with the side of her thumbnail. 30 paces east of the surface well brought her through winter fern and broken branches. The leaning hemlock grew from a limestone shelf darkened by moss. Beneath it stood a marker no higher than her knee. Thomas Elias Mercer's service number 138-472, 1927-1942. No body rested there. The stone was a place for a name that had returned without a man. Elara cleared the moss from the lower edge using a cedar twig. Then she placed the purple heart against the carved dates for 1 quiet minute before returning it to its envelope. Back inside, she chose Hollis's hand-cranked blower tester from the tool roll. Its bearings had stiffened, but the leather drive belt remained whole. She cleaned the spindle with kerosene, added 2 drops of light machine oil, and turned the handle slowly. The first revolution scraped. The 5th moved more easily. By the 20th, the small impeller produced a steady breath against her palm. A strip of paper lifted from the bench and trembled in the moving air. The old object had not returned to life dramatically. It had simply begun doing its work again. Elara considered how many small acts had carried her to that room. Mrs. Bell had recognized a surname and opened a survey folder she was not required to find. The custodian in Clifton Forge had left a rail station door unlatched on a freezing night. Owen Pike had trusted a muddy stranger with an account book and a free repair manual. The elderly man beside the trout-shaped mailbox had warned her where the road washed away, then sent her uphill without asking what she owned. None of them knew what waited behind the locking plate. Their kindness had not depended upon a reward. Before we move forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had nothing to gain. Perhaps it was a door left open, a meal placed quietly beside you, or a warning offered at the right moment. Tell us about that person in the comments. Some gifts remain useful long after the giver has forgotten them. That evening, Elara boiled well water for 10 full minutes and poured it through one of the ceramic elements Hollis had wrapped 3 decades earlier. She tested the cooled water with a field strip, waited the required 60 seconds, and held the result beneath the flashlight. Acceptable. She ate beside the galley stove, then carried the canvas tool roll and the sealed materials into the communications room. The gold remained behind the hidden plate, locked inside the mechanism that had protected it through years of damp and silence. Before sleeping, she placed Hollis's caliper, the brass gauge, and the hand-cranked blower tester in a straight line beside her coat. For the first time, the objects beside her were not all she had left. They were what she could begin with. The first snow arrived on December 3rd and left 4 inches over the buried roof, smoothing the bunker into the hillside until only the head wall and ventilation tower remained visible. Elara read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the galley stove. The entrance shed attached to the concrete head wall measured 12 by 18 feet with a shallow gable that had lost nearly half its slate-colored shingles. She calculated 6 bundles of asphalt shingles, 2 rolls of 15-pound felt, and 5 pounds of galvanized roofing nails, allowing 10% for mistakes. Owen Pike delivered the materials in his truck. Before leaving, he handed her a roofing hatchet with a square face and a leather-wrapped handle. "It belonged to my uncle," he said. "He would dislike it rusting." The next morning, Amos Reed appeared without being asked. He was 74, narrow as a fence post, and had spent 40 years roofing houses from Alderson to Marlinton. He refused payment by closing Elara's hand around the coins she offered. They removed the damaged sheathing, sistered one split rafter with a straight 8-foot board, and snapped a chalk line across each course. Amos taught her to set a nail with one stroke, drive it with the second, and finish it flush with the third. "That nail's proud." Elara checked the raised head. "Pull it." They worked 11 days. Wind came hard across the ridge, lifting the felt until Elara learned to kneel on its lower edge while Amos fastened the top. On December 14th, they laid the final ridge cap beneath a sky the color of unpolished steel. Amos tested the line with one gloved palm, nodded once, and climbed down. January exposed what the first fire had concealed. 3 bricks above the galley roofline were spalling their faces, peeling away in red flakes. Mortar powdered beneath Elara's fingertip. She removed each loose joint to a depth of 3/4 of an inch, brushed away the dust, and soaked the masonry so it would not steal moisture from the repair. Owen helped her choose hydraulic lime and fire clay. She mixed them at 3 parts lime to 1 part fire clay, adding water slowly until the mortar held a ridge on the trowel without slumping. The work took 3 weeks most days, beginning at 24 or 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Elara could not shape the narrow joints well in gloves. Every 15 minutes she climbed down, held her bare hands near the galley stove until feeling returned, then went back to the scaffold. She replaced 2 broken bricks, rebuilt the crown with a slight outward slope, and left a flexible gap around the clay liner. At night she covered the chimney with burlap and an old wool blanket to slow the cure. On January 29th she lit a small test fire. The flame leaned toward the throat. Smoke climbed without hesitation, passed through the repaired stack, and disappeared into a pale winter sky. Elara remained outside until the last visible thread was gone. The communications room had been added before the main bunker was sealed beneath earth. Its white pine planks rested over sleepers fixed to the concrete slab, each board held by hand-cut rosehead nails left from an earlier structure. Years of damp had darkened the wood almost black. Elara rented a random orbit sander from Owen for $14 per day. She drove every raised nail below the surface with a punch, then made 3 passes, 80 grit to remove the damaged finish, 120 to level the grain, and 220 for the final smoothing. Dust entered her cuffs and settled along her eyelashes. Beneath the old surface, the boards changed from dark honey toward mahogany, marked by knots and narrow saw lines no machine could imitate. She wiped the floor with mineral spirits and applied 3 thin coats of tung oil mixture, allowing each one to penetrate before removing the excess. The final coat required a 48-hour cure, during which she crossed the room only on 2 loose planks laid as a temporary path. One morning she woke unable to lift the sander. She walked instead to the marsh below the access road. A great blue heron stood in the shallows with one leg hidden beneath its body. For nearly an hour neither of them moved. When the bird opened its wings and rose over the reeds, Elara returned to the bunker but did no work that day. The floor waited without complaint. The entrance shed contained 8 windows. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The 8th held a wavering original pane dated 1788 in a small scratch notation near the sash, likely salvaged from an older mountain house before the government construction. Elara preserved it exactly as she found it. She removed the remaining sashes one by one, numbered every part in pencil, and softened the old compound with low heat. After bedding each replacement pane, she rolled Day P33 glazing putty between her palms and pressed it firmly against the glass. The putty knife traveled at a steady angle, leaving a clean bevel wide enough to cover the glazing points without showing from inside. Several counterweight cords had rotted through. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, feeding each line over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot where it entered the cast iron weight. The last window resisted her for an afternoon. One sash had swollen and the upper meeting rail sat 1/8 of an inch high. Elara planed the edge in careful strokes, tested it, and removed only what the wood allowed. When the sash finally moved without binding, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch outside. Its claws closed around the narrow twig. It looked through the newly set glass while Elara stood with the putty knife still in her hand. Then it flew toward the hill and the window remained clear. The plaster failed first beside the chimney. Elara's initial patch dried too quickly and cracked by morning. The second sagged from the hand-split oak lath. The third held for 2 days, then released in one pale shell when the stove warmed the wall. Owen found an old bag of horsehair in the loft above his store, tied with cotton cord and labeled in his uncle's handwriting. Elara washed the hair, separated it by hand, and mixed it into lime plaster until the fibers crossed the trowel like fine roots. She dampened the lath before each application. The scored scratch coat keyed through the gaps and hardened around the oak. A 3/8-inch brown coat followed, leveled but left slightly rough, then cured for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final coat measured 1/8 inch and took the light in soft, uneven planes. Elara pressed her palm against the finished wall after it had cooled. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Lyle owned the Red Door Cafe and wore her gray hair in a braid wound twice around the back of her head. She began leaving paper bags beside the bunker entrance before sunrise. Some held biscuits wrapped in wax paper, others held soup in jars with the lids loosened for cooling. The original plaster was horsehair laid over hand-split oak lath, and every new patch Ruby tried dried too quickly against the warmed masonry. The first cracked overnight, the second released from the keys behind the lath. The third held for 2 days, then fell in one pale sheet while she was sweeping. Doris pushed it back across the counter without counting it. In candles when the shop reopens. There was no shop yet, but Doris said the sentence as if she had seen one. Caleb Pike arrived on a blue Schwinn in the first week of March. He was 16, all elbows and careful silence, with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. Without asking permission, he began reducing the fallen walnut limbs beside the road into stove lengths. Elara offered him 2 folded bills. He shook his head and pointed toward the bunker with the maul handle. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He worked until the bicycle rack held more wood than seemed possible, then pushed it downhill rather than risk the brakes. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk from the Methodist parsonage to an elderly parishioner's house beyond Big Draft Road. His black coat had one polished elbow, and his hat was always held at the same careful angle when he greeted Elara. He never entered unless invited. He never asked what she had found. On the coldest mornings, he paused beside the cattle guard, tipped his hat, and said, "Keep her safe below." Then he continued down the road. The words remained in the air after his footsteps were gone. Elara postponed the lower cellar until February 11th, when 3 dry days brought the groundwater below the bottom hinge of the interior blast door. She drained the remaining water through the emergency sump, greased the locking dogs, and moved the manual lever 1 inch at a time. The door opened onto 7 granite steps, descending into a 12 by 15-foot chamber with a fieldstone floor. At its center lay a dressed granite slab marked with a carved symbol, a circle crossed by 3 rising lines, the old Mercer sign for purified air. Elara cleaned its edges but did not lift it. Under the 3rd step, her flashlight caught a straight corner where no stone should have been. She reached into the gap and drew out a small oak box, blackened by damp but still sound. Inside rested a brass key whose bow had been shaped into the same circle in 3 rising lines. Beneath the key lay a tintype. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside a smaller stone cottage on the same hill long before the concrete headwall existed. She held a pressure-testing pump against one hip. Her eyes, brow, and narrow jaw belonged so closely to Elara that the resemblance seemed less like inheritance than interruption. On the back, written in faded white ink, were the words, "Ruth Mercer, daughter of Elias, age 25, summer of 1903. Elara carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel above the galley stove. She tried it in every cabinet, lockbox, and surviving door. It opened nothing. There it remained, catching firelight without offering an answer. Snow retreated first from the access road, then from the southern face of the hill. The creek below the bunker grew loud with runoff. Walnut catkins lengthened above the new windows and scattered yellow pollen across the concrete apron. Elara decided not to restore the full air plant that spring. The work required better seals-tested media and more knowledge than determination alone could supply. She chose one British sovereign from the reserve, recorded its date and weight, and sold it through a licensed dealer in Charleston. The money purchased sample cartridges, new tubing test reagents, and enough gasket material for practice. She built small systems on the steel bench and failed where failure could be measured safely. One seal pinched. One carbon bed channeled water along its edge. A ceramic element cracked because she tightened the housing while it was cold. She wrote down every mistake. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Elara completed the first system she was willing to sign. It was not large enough to protect a city or even the whole bunker. It was a hand-built emergency filtration cabinet for a mountain clinic that lost power several times each winter. The cabinet held a washable pre-filter, an activated carbon stage, a silver resin cartridge, and a manual blower that could be operated by one person. She tested it for 6 hours under load. At the end, the pressure remained steady within half an inch of water column. Elara stamped the inspection plate with the circle and 3 rising lines, then added her initials beneath Hollis's. The restored rooms had become spare and useful. The white pine floor reflected the low amber light of shielded lamps. Hollis's tools hung above the workbench in measured outlines. The communications map had been cleaned and flattened behind glass. Nothing covered the concrete walls, merely to hide their age. The bunker still looked like a bunker. That spring, while clearing dead growth around the oldest walnut tree, Elara found a narrow brass plate set into the trunk where the wood had grown around its edges. It bore the Mercer craft mark. She returned with the key from the mantel. The lock resisted until she cleaned it with a drop of oil and eased the key clockwise. A small panel opened inward, revealing a cavity lined with hammered copper. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag protected by waxed cloth and a note dated November 11, 1918. Ruth Mercer had written it during the final hours of the First World War. She described bells ringing in Lewisburg and men gathering outside the telegraph office to read the armistice notice. Elias, her father, had refused to join the crowd until he finished repairing the spring filter at the school. Influenza had already taken 3 children there, and he would not allow celebration to delay clean water. Ruth wrote that the flag had flown above the school pump house while local soldiers were overseas. She hid it because cloth carried memory poorly when handled too often, and because every generation required one object that had not been turned into money. Her last line read, "Keep this until someone knows that survival is not fear of dying, it is care for the living." Elara refolded the note along its weakened seams. She returned the flag to the copper-lined cavity and added a fresh envelope containing a copy of Hollis's filtration instructions. The original letter remained inside the bunker, protected with the tools. On July 27, 2025, the 72nd anniversary of the Korean Armistice Agreement, she carried Thomas Elias Mercer's Purple Heart to the West Virginia National Cemetery in Grafton. There was no grave bearing his name, only a memorial space near the flag court where families left flowers for those not returned. Elara stood there until the mourning ceremony ended, then held the medal beneath the folded program. She did not donate it or bury it. She brought it home. By then, 4 coins had been used. 1 paid for safe filtration materials. 1 replaced the failed sump pump. 1 funded structural testing of the lower chamber. The 4th purchased a certified water analysis kit and laboratory fees for the spring. Every transaction entered Hollis's ledger with the date, purpose, coin type, weight, and sale value. The remaining bullion and coins went back into the steel case. Elara added desiccant, updated the inventory, and sealed the compartment inside the hydraulic lock. On the outer wrapper, she wrote 2 words: "The next one." The first request for work came through an index card pinned to the corkboard at the Red Door Cafe. Hand-rebuilt emergency water and air systems, careful repair of obsolete equipment, ask Doris for Elara. Doris placed the card between a church supper notice and an advertisement for a used cider press. Within 3 months, more than 40 names appeared on a mailing list kept in a school composition book. Most belonged to farms, clinics, volunteer fire stations, and old houses with wells no one had tested in years. Elara accepted only the work she could perform exactly. Caleb returned one Saturday in October, taller and quieter, driving Owen's truck. A long wooden sign rested in the bed beneath a canvas tarp. I had carved Site 4B Filtration Works across a walnut board and filled the letters with black milk paint. Beneath the main line in smaller capitals, he had added Mercer and Daughters. Elara traced the final word. "There has never been an and Daughters," she said. Caleb leaned against the tailgate. A pale scar crossed one thumb where the carving knife had slipped. "There should have been." They mounted the sign inside the entrance shed rather than outside by the road. Snow and sun would not reach it there. Visitors saw it only after passing through the steel door. That winter, Elara began a letter of her own. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote at the steel bench while the ventilation fan moved clean air through the upper rooms. She described the locations of shut-off valves, the difference between safe and unsafe pressure loss, and the exact order for testing the spring after floodwater. She included no account of betrayal. Instead, she wrote the names of those who had helped Nadine Bell, who kept $1 in a courthouse drawer; Owen Pike, who opened a credit account; Doris Lyle, who asked for payment in candles; Amos Reed, who recognized a proud nail; Caleb Pike, who carved a place for Daughters; and Reverend Boyd, who prayed without entering. She explained that 4 coins had been used and why. She left blank space below the final paragraph for another hand. Years earlier, the underground rooms had looked like the end of every road available to her. Now they held measured airflow, clean water-labeled tools, and enough silence for careful decisions. The bunker had been waiting. On the last evening of that winter, Elara shut down the test blower and listened while the pressure equalized through the ducts. The needle on Hollis's brass gauge descended slowly to 0. Outside, snow settled over the roof and the young birches. Inside, the hidden reserve remained behind the blast door, not as a fortune promised to her, but as work postponed for someone not yet known. A decommissioned Cold War bunker waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Nadine Bell continued to use the same brass stamp press. The worn dollar Elara had left remained in the shallow desk drawer beneath it, folded beside a dry ink pad and Hollis Mercer's old survey note. Mrs. Bell never spent it. When new clerks asked why it was there, she said only that some deeds required more than a seal.